Alright guys, welcome to another video. This video is going to be about the E55's engine rebuild, and I decided to do this in parts because it is going to be a long process rebuilding this engine. And well, first of all, the engine is not even from an E55, it's actually from a CLS 55. This first part is just going to be about reaching this stage, which is basically just disassembling the engine. So I've disassembled the engine, I've taken the crank and the cylinder heads off, and I've given it a good cleaning. I've cleaned it on the inside because this engine was all garbage, like it was all covered in carbon. It was not a clean engine at all, which you'll later see in the video. And I've painted the outside because the outside was all covered in like that salt and everything because I guess it was a winter driven car. There's still some more cleaning work left on the inside, but anyways, I'll show you in the videos how I got to this part, and then I'm going to start rebuilding from here in the next part. So measuring out the clearances, putting all the parts back in, blowing air through the oil lines, and making sure everything is okay. So all that will be coming in all the next parts, but for this first part I'll just show you how to get to this part, which is basically the starting part of the rebuild. Just to give you guys a quick recap on the project, on what's happened over the last few videos. So I had a time attack E55 that I used to compete with at the CSCS, which is basically a time attack series here in Canada. But one day I was at the track and I was tuning the car even before the season started, and the engine blew. So then I had to go through the hassle of removing the engine on my driveway, pulling the engine apart and taking it apart to see what caused the issue. And then later, luckily, I found another used engine, which was from a CLS 55. So I bought that engine, but when I took that engine apart, I realized that engine had the exact same issue that my E55 engine had. But the problem was at a much earlier stage, so the engine is still at the point where it could be rebuilt. So that's where you find me right now, and that's why I'm rebuilding this engine. If you want to watch all the videos in detail, it's all on my channel, you can go through those. But for now, let's just get right into how to take one of these engines apart. Now for the video, I took footage from two different engines. So at first I was working on my E55 engine, and later I moved to the other engine, but it's still the full process. I showed you everything, like all the main steps needed to remove it. So first I started off by removing the surge tanks, which are held in by these torx bolts that are on top of the surge tanks. And then there's these two hose clamps that are at the back. You don't need to take the bolts out, because the reason I leave the bolts in is because they're all different lengths. So if you take them out, it's a hassle figuring out which bolt goes where. And after that, you can start removing your injector rail. It's held in by these four E-torx bolts. Once the bolts are off, you need to remove these air lines that are for the crankcase ventilation. Once those are off, you can pull the injector rail off, but you need to remove the plugs that are going to each injector. And once all the plugs are removed, you can just lift the injector rail off and put that aside. After that, there's these 5 torx bolts that are holding the supercharger in place. Well, there's 5 on one side and then 5 on the other side. These bolts are located on either side of the intake runners. So just carefully remove these bolts. That's all that's holding the supercharger in place. But after that, there's a lot of wires and stuff that you need to remove. You need to remove that wire for the air temperature sensor. Then you need to remove these plugs that are going to the throttle body and also to the recirculating valve. You need to remove your manifold pressure sensor, MAP sensor. And then you need to remove this vacuum line that's going to the solenoid over here at the front of the engine. Then you need to remove the connector that's going to your supercharger clutch that engages your clutch on your supercharger. Then you need to remove these two bolts that are holding this bracket that hold your intercooler lines in place, the lines that go to your intercooler that's underneath your supercharger. Make sure not to lose those bolts. After that, you can just lift your supercharger off, but be careful, it is a heavy supercharger. It weighs around 40 kilograms, so careful not to drop it. Once the supercharger is out of the way, you can start disassembling the valve covers. And the first step is to remove your ignition coils. They're held in by these torx bolts again, and just remove all the torx bolts and the ignition coils come off. And I like using a 17mm spanner to remove these ignition coils. There is a special tool that Mercedes recommend to use, which is basically just a 17mm spanner. So yeah, just use a 17mm spanner, it works pretty well. Once these are off, now I move to the second engine, but it's at the same stage where that engine was at. The only thing different over here is that I've also removed the wiring harness, and that engine still had the wiring harness on. So next I had to remove the bolts that are holding my valve covers in place. There's 11 bolts, they're E10 I believe, torx bolts. And once all these are removed, you can just simply pull the valve covers off. After that, I removed my oil filter because I had to remove my oil filter housing. It's not necessary to do it at this point, but if you do it, it makes the rest of the job easier. That's why I just removed it now. You need a 46mm hex socket for removing this, and you need an extension and a breaker bar. It is a really big bolt, so you need one of these big sockets. But yeah, just undo the bolt and that comes off. There's only one bolt holding it in, and there's an o-ring that goes under this that you should be replacing because that o-ring leaks all the time. You should be replacing it anyways because that's one of the things I found. It was leaking on this engine and it was leaking on the other engine as well. I actually replaced all the o-rings on this engine. There's not a single o-ring on this engine that is good. All these o-rings leak, so it's probably better to replace all of them. Next, I inserted this 27mm socket on my, well, the bolt that holds the crank pulley in place. And you have to bring the crank pulley to 40 degrees. The position is 40 degrees. That is marked on your hydraulic damper. And make sure that your cam is at the right place. Now for this you should be using a special tool which is there for holding your camshaft in place. But I didn't have that tool, so I just put it at that place where the tool should be. But it's not too important for disassembling anyways. It's more important for assembling to get the timing right. After that, just use a zip tie to hold the timing chain in place, so when you remove the timing chain sprocket it doesn't fall off, it stays on the timing chain. And then you can remove your timing chain tensioner. Now for the next series of steps, just make sure to do it in this exact sequence because it is important that you shouldn't be moving your timing chain, that you shouldn't be moving your camshafts without moving your crank because this is an interference engine. So if you move your crank, it can happen that one of your valves can move and hit a piston and bend itself. So you can damage your engine even before you take it off. So it's important to follow these sequence of steps. What I like doing is remove this bearing bridge first that holds the cams in place. With this bearing bridge gone, all your valves will close by default and then they won't move anymore. So when you're removing your camshafts then, and even if you do move your camshafts, there's no risk of damaging your engine. We're removing these camshaft bearing bridges, which is a long difficult name. You just have to remove these torque bolts, but you have to remove them in a sequence. The sequence is opposite to the torquing sequence, and you can find this diagram in the service manual. So that's why I was looking at that paper and just following that diagram. So I removed these in the right procedure. So you basically keep on torquing them until all the bolts are loose and all the spring tension is released from your valves. And then once all of it is loose, you can just follow any pattern and just loosen the bolts the rest of the way. You don't need to take these bolts out entirely because some of them are different lengths, so I just find it easier to leave them in place. And then once all the bolts are off, you can just simply lift this bridge off. Once the camshaft bearing bridges are off on both sides, then next you can finally get to removing your camshafts. I like doing it in this process because at this point, even if you move your camshafts, there's no risk of damaging anything. Now the camshafts you'll need to hold the camshaft sprocket with a 27mm spanner, and then you'll need a breaker bar to remove that torx bolt that holds the camshaft sprocket in place. It is like torqued extremely tight. You'll need some type of extension to remove it. And then once it's loosened, you can just remove an impact driver. You can just use an impact driver or something to just open it the rest of the way. And now you can simply just remove your camshaft sprockets. Once the sprockets are removed, your camshafts can just come out. Now these camshafts do have an oil gallery in them, so there would be oil inside them, but my camshafts were pretty dry, I guess because the engine was sitting for so long. Once the camshafts are out of the way, you can start removing the heads, and there's a certain sequence for this too. So first you remove these torx bolts that are labeled A and B in the diagram. In the service manual, you'll find all these diagrams in the service manual, all the torx procedures and the torque specifications. That's one thing I really recommend you guys to download if you want to do any work on these engines. You can also find the diagrams online, but it's still better to have the full service manual. After that, I was untorquing these bolts, the main bolts for the cylinder heads that hold the cylinder heads to the engine block. And there's a certain pattern for untorquing these as well, so you need to follow that pattern. Otherwise, there is a risk of warping your head even before you remove it. And the bolt for this is T55, and they're torqued extremely tight, so you're going to be losing some calories when you're undoing these bolts. There's 10 bolts in total, but just make sure to follow the pattern. And once they're loosened, then you can just take them off the remainder of the way in any pattern you want using your impact driver. Once all the bolts are untorqued, you can just use your magnet to remove the bolts the rest of the way. And then once all of this is done, you can just simply lift the head off, but be careful, there's still coolant inside it. I should have drained the coolant using a drain plug that's on the block, right underneath the heads. But I thought the engine would be pretty dry considering there was no oil inside it, but weirdly there was still coolant inside it. So yeah, then just take it off and you can see that this engine has quite a bit of carbon buildup inside the engine. So after this, the next few steps were what I covered in another video anyway, so I'll just take this part from that other video just for the sake of getting everything in one video. So this is a part for removing the lower oil pan and the upper oil pan and also the oil pump. Next I removed these E10 bolts that hold the lower oil pan in place. And once all the bolts are removed, all you need to do is just tap it with a hammer and a chisel just slightly just to break the oil pan loose of the gasket maker. And then you need to pry it. My one was stuck in place, so I had to use 2 screwdrivers just to like pry it a little better. Once that's off, you need to remove this plate that sits on top of the upper oil pan, and it's held in place by these 10mm hex bolts. After removing that, there's a whole bunch of bolts for the upper oil pan that go all around the upper oil pan. Just make sure to remove them and be careful not to drop any of those bolts in the engine because then you'll be in big trouble. After that, just pry the upper oil pan and it should come off. After that, there's just these torque bolts that hold the oil pump in place. I believe they're T50 torx. But yeah, there's 2 on this side and then there's 1 on the other side of the oil pump. Just remove all of these, and then other than that, there's just these smaller torx bolts that just hold the tube in place. And once all these are removed, your oil pump should just come off. Now the next step was to remove the main pulley or the hydraulic damper. It's held in place by a 27mm socket, but first you need to hold this pulley in place. Now the proper tool for this is a crank pulley holder, but the problem is that if you're just one person doing this on an engine stand, it would pretty much be impossible holding that and untorquing the bolt at the same time unless you're extremely strong. So I like using this method, using an old supercharger belt and just wrap it around the pulley and just clamp it to one side. And you don't even need to clamp it too hard because the belt actually digs into the grooves and it actually holds the pulley quite well in place. But I guess it's a matter of preference. Some people would prefer using the pulley holder, some people would prefer just clamping something to the flywheel. But once the bolt is off, you can just get the pulley off by hand. Just pull it really hard and just like wiggle it a little, and it usually just comes out by hand. Having a crank pulley puller tool, there's a special tool for this that's meant for pulling these pulleys out. Having that would make it a lot easier to pull it out, but usually you can just get these out by hand. They're not too tight. So after this, I had to remove my water pump, and because next I had to remove my timing cover. So for removing the timing cover, I have to remove the water pump and a few other pulleys that sit on the timing cover itself. So for removing the water pump, there's a few of these torx bolts that are holding it in place, and just remove all these bolts. For one of these bolts, before you can remove it completely, you have to remove that plastic pulley. But once the bolts are off, the water pump just comes off. And there's a gasket behind this one too, you should be replacing every time. My gasket was already leaking, so I could see coolant all over the place. After that, just remove all these torx bolts that are holding your timing cover in place. Now these are all different lengths and they're all like placed in weird locations, so there is a diagram for this one in the service manual too that actually tells you that which ones go where, and it also tells you what locations to apply the sealant when you put the timing cover back on. So that's extremely important to follow when you're putting everything back on, but I guess I'm going to talk more about that when I'm reassembling everything. Right now for removing it's easy, you just unbolt all those bolts. And there's these few different points where you break the timing cover loose from, so just so you can split it from the gasket maker. And once you do that, there's one thing I should have done. I should have kept my timing chain in place, which I didn't do, and this happened. Everything just fell off when the timing cover came off. So yeah, I should have zip tied or something, attached something to the timing chain so they just didn't fall off when I took the timing cover off. But it's okay since I was planning to replace the guides and everything anyways. It was this weird piece I found inside after I removed this timing cover. It was a weird rubber piece. I believe the only place it could have come from was from an old valve cover gasket. Someone might have replaced that earlier and dropped one of these pieces in the engine. That's the only place I'm guessing it came from. Some other things I found inside the engine was that my timing chain guides were almost broken. They had cracks on them and one piece actually had fallen off. So yeah, they were pretty close to the limit. They should have been replaced at this point now. The timing chain itself wasn't pretty bad. I don't think it had stretched, but when I'll get the new chain, then I guess it will be interesting to compare if it has stretched. But yeah, it didn't seem too worn. It was just the guides that seemed pretty bad. The other thing that was really close to the limit was there's these two O-rings on the timing cover that seal a water line. It's a water line that goes to your block. And if these rubber O-rings break, they'll send coolant all in your oil. So they'll just dump coolant in your oil sump. And this is what the condition of my O-ring was. It was cracked and it was really close to the limit. I believe it was still sealing at this point, but if that crack went all the way, that definitely means that coolant would have entered the oil and that would have been another mess. Really difficult to fix because the whole timing cover actually needs to come off to get to this O-ring to actually replace it. And this is something that I've heard of other people having too, this issue, like this O-ring cracks and then the coolant mixes with the oil. In fact, one person that commented on my last YouTube video, he also said he had worked on a car with this issue. So I think this issue is also something to really keep in mind. It's something that can happen on these cars. Next, you have to remove your flex plate from the car. And this is also held in by some Torx bolts, so you just remove them and then the whole plate comes off. And next there's this plate, it's called the rear main cover, or it's called the rear crankshaft cover, something like that. But anyways, there's just these bunch of Torx bolts on it that you need to remove. And once you remove them, you can just pry it off. It's just held in by gasket maker. But just pry it off gently because it is a really light piece, so you don't want to bend it by prying it too hard or something. And this is probably also a good time to change your rear main seals while you're at this, because the rear main seal also sits on this cover. Another really weird thing I found about this cover that I should point out, because it could become a nightmare for someone else, is that when I got this engine was like, there was oil coming out of this hole from the side, and the oil was dripping all like on the side of the engine and also underneath the engine. And I had no idea at that point where that oil was coming from. So now I finally figured out where that oil was actually coming from, because on the top of the engine, like in the V, there's actually this hole over here which is supposed to be a drain hole. So if water or something fills in the V of the engine, it can actually be drained down from there. So there's actually a passage over there that goes all the way to this hole, which is this passage that's sealed by that rear main cover. So it's basically just sealed by gasket maker, so there's a hole on the top and then there's a hole at the bottom. That hole at the bottom actually leads the water out from that hole on the side. But I'm guessing what happened was that gasket maker had a leak in it or something, so rather than just draining water from that hole out from that side of the engine, it was actually draining the oil from inside the engine to outside the engine from that hole over there. Which is not that bad, it's just an oil leak after all, but if you have to fix that oil leak, that means you'll have to remove the engine from the transmission, you'll have to take this small cover off, and then you'll have to reapply the gasket maker just to fix this leak. So yeah, that could be a nightmare of a job just for fixing a small oil leak. Now after this, you're going to be removing your pistons and your connecting rods, so make sure to label your pistons before you remove them. And then after that, you can flip your engine over and then you can loosen your connecting rod bolts. But one thing to be careful of is that when you remove your connecting rods, all these end caps have to go on the same connecting rods they came off from, on the same position, because they are machined together. These connecting rods are made in one piece and then they're fractured later. It's called split fracture connecting rods, I believe. So yeah, just make sure to keep that in mind wherever the connecting rod end caps come from. You return them to the same connecting rod. My bearings were spun, so they were a little difficult to remove, but usually the bearing just comes off with the end cap when you remove the end cap. For pulling the piston out, just be careful of one thing, that when you're pulling it out, the connecting rod doesn't hit against the cylinder walls, because if it scrapes against the cylinder walls, it can scratch them. These cylinder walls are extremely sensitive, they're LSL coated, so just make sure to be careful of that, don't scrape it against the walls. Once your pistons and connecting rods are out, next you can actually start unbolting your main caps, the caps that are holding the crankshaft in place. For these ones, there's also a torque sequence, and that's also found in the service manual, and you have to go in the opposite order. So the torque sequence, they tell you to like install the main caps in, you have to follow the opposite sequence for untorquing them. So that's basically outside in, so you start from the outside bolt and you make your way to the inside bolt, and the same with the caps, you start with the caps on the outside and then you make your way to the ones in the center. And once they're removed, also keep these in order. They are labeled from 1 to 5, so there are numbers printed on them, but just be careful not to mix these up because they have to go exactly in the way they came out from, because the clearances won't match if these are mixed up. So just make sure to put all of these in order. And once all these are off, you can just lift the crankshaft out. Those bearings that fell out were the thrust bearings. They're the bearings that are there to prevent axial movement of the crankshaft, so they prevent the crankshaft from moving forwards and backwards. Now, one more thing I have to tell you about these crankshaft bearings is that they actually, all the bearings are not the same. They actually have different part numbers and they go by colors. So the colors are actually laser printed on the crankshaft. So when you pull the gears of the crankshaft off, you can actually see this these letters over here, the GRGRR, and that actually refers to the thickness of the bearing. So the clearances in this engine are matched so precisely that if you go with even the wrong bearing, the wrong color of the wrong bearing on the wrong place, your clearances won't match up. That's something I'll talk about more in the next video. But for now, yeah, that's pretty much it for disassembling the engine. After that, I cleaned and painted the engine, but I didn't record too much of that since that was just like cleaning and painting an engine. For the insides, I cleaned all of it with a wire brush, like all the surfaces that were not mating surfaces or none of the surfaces that were machined. You never clean those with a wire brush or something because you don't want to scratch those surfaces. But for all the other surfaces, I just cleaned them with a wire brush. For the mating surfaces, I just used acetone to clean all the gasket maker or those things off. And for the oil passages, I just used gasoline to clean because that usually dissolves all the oil residue and everything just comes off. But I still need to do a better job of cleaning all the oil passages and making sure there's nothing left inside them because any dirt or anything left inside those oil passages can get dislodged later, and it's the worst thing to happen that you just rebuild an engine and something gets dislodged and gets stuck in a bearing and destroys the whole thing again. So I'll need to do a better job at that. But let me know if you guys want to see more of the cleaning and painting part. Maybe I can include that in the next video since there's still a lot more to do. There's still the heads to do and a lot of other things. Oh, by the way, another thing I have to mention, if you guys are interested in all this engine stuff, there's actually another channel I found out, and that guy has a lot of content on these engines. His name is Tassos. Don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but I'll link it in the description below. He has a lot of good content on these engines, the M157, the M156, and all these AMG engines. So if you guys are more interested in this stuff, you can also check out his channel. But yeah, that's it for now. Thanks a lot for watching. Hopefully see you guys in the next part.